Okay, everyone. Well, welcome to the final panel session we have. As Peter was saying, it's very timely that David Cameron has said something about social mobility. I think it's the first time he's really spoken so clearly about it, and I hope Peter doesn't mind me saying, but Peter's been asked to speak to the Cabinet for an hour on social mobility next month. I hope that's all right, Peter, to tell everyone. So it'd be quite good for someone who knows a little bit about the subject to talk to the Cabinet. So I thought I'd just mention that. But the panel session today, as Peter was saying, is what universities select for. And we're very privileged to have three fabulous speakers to talk about this topic, which can be very controversial, very critical issue, how you select students. And we'll do a similar format. We'll have speakers for 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to questions. So first, Dr. Marlyn McGrath served as Director of Admissions at Harvard for, I think, 26 years, Marlyn, isn't it? And before that, you had several other positions at Harvard. So you, and part of that job, I think it's fair to say that as a central part of that has been this unerring commitment to widening access to students from all backgrounds. Now, Harvard is consistently ranked, I think, first in the world in all the international league tables. I'm looking at John O'Leary, one of the compilers here. I think that's pretty fair to say. But what's central to that, I think, is that access is seen as a core part of that success. And Marlyn recently wrote, "If Harvard is to remain a national and world leader, we must continue to seek new ways to find talents in all its forms." And Marlyn was also brave enough to invite Peter to the admissions panel discussion all those years ago. I wonder what experience that was. And of course, Peter's been talking about that ever since. So I'll hand over to you, Marlyn, if you want to start the proceedings for 10 minutes. Thanks.
Shall I stand up or just speak?
I don't have a great voice, so. You stand there because there's mics.
Okay.
So
the only reason I brought this slide was that I thought it was bad manners not to bring something as a slide, so that's my slide. But I'm really delighted to be here. I'm honored to be here, delighted to be here, and this has been a lot of fun as well as unbelievably interesting to me. We share, the Anglo-American group, a sense of inadequacy, shortfall, I should say, in questions of access. I will say that much as economists and sociologists in the United States use that language, I think in universities it's a little less the point for us, and I'll get back to that subtle point in just a moment. But I should say that we're shortfall and so on in terms of socioeconomic disparities. Mary's numbers, those three conclusions she showed at the end, mirror very strongly the numbers in the United States as a whole. Now, this is not a Harvard thing, this is an American thing. The disparities in college participation, as we call it college, participation by income level of family, by men and women, which is a growing change, a disparity in the United States, and also by preparation levels. We don't have A levels and so on, but there's an analogous sense of what people have prepared during the 4 years, at least, of secondary school. For us, we talked yesterday about a lot of the things that are the most important ingredients to what we do in admissions at Harvard and in other selective universities, which vary, by the way, greatly in the United States, and that can't be said often enough. But recruitment is the key to the whole thing, and I learned a lot yesterday, and I hope other people did too, about some of the things that work and some of the things that don't work, and some of the things that we might do together. But when I was invited to come by Peter to this wonderful conference, he asked me to describe, you remember this is true, because I have notes, the Harvard model of admissions, how it works, and what we think we're doing. So I will, of course, sound Philistine in describing any of this at all, but I want to give you the overview because it's the context in which anything we do, whether it's recruitment, whether it's metrics, what we're measuring and how we're tracking our progress, all of that gets, of course, measured in a certain context. I'm not talking now about national political public policy context, in which is the larger context for all of us. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of the key elements of our admissions process. Our selection process, and this is true, I think, of any university, any institution with any dignity at all, if we still have a shred of that, is idiosyncratic, designed to suit very specific institutional goals. I say that obvious thing only because I'm struck by the reluctance of many university people to understand or at least admit the obvious idea that we ignore, at our peril probably. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And by the way, there are a lot of ways to do university admissions in the United States which work quite well. But I did promise to come and talk about what Harvard does and how we do it. The process, like anybody's process, has its roots in our past. Indeed, in Harvard's case, in several distinct layers of our past. And I should mention those roots before I came here to do, to respond to the questions of exactly what we do and how and why. Harvard was established a long time ago, even before the Great Fire in London, by the fragile Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636. By American standards, this is old. It has been referred to, we have a song about this, maybe even without exaggeration, as the first flower of their wilderness. Explicitly, Harvard's founders, quote, dreaded to leave an illiterate ministry, but sought also to ensure literate civic leadership. That's a basic notion for us. And the university created at that moment was much more than a flower to them. It was really intended, and still is, to serve very pragmatic goals. When the first printing press in the New World, we had that printing press, they had that, my predecessors, I've been around for a long time, but not quite that long. They printed a Bible in the native language of Algonquian in order to assist the conversions of the Native Americans. Okay, nothing fancy here. The first telescope in the New World was intended not for the scientific study of astronomy, but for the proper planting of crops. Students weren't going to Harvard to become scholars. New England was a pretty hard-scrabble place, and the luxuries that we think we see today were not in place. But by the end of the 19th century, a lot of things changed. There was a much more European, much more recognizable to people here, European element had been added. Charles William Elliot, who was a very long-serving president from the 19th to the 20th century, transformed the faculty into a temple of learning for its own sake and discovery for its own sake. New fields of modern languages and literatures and history and art, things not taught before at Harvard, were added. And his inaugural address, and this was quite earth-shaking at the time, said of those fields and others, "We will have them all and at their best." Now, we still think this of course, is a great commitment, financially and otherwise. But the students who were being taught then, still being enrolled in Harvard, were drawn from the very narrow circle of families who had always, or at least as long as the colony had existed, sent their sons to Harvard. That's the part that hasn't changed. The 20th century Harvard set out to change that, and this has been our major work. The college has worked for really more than a century to do two things. One is to improve the quality of the students, the raw material, who were once referred to as a kind of lumber, honest to God. Second, hearkening back to an earlier purpose, to increase access or representation for students from all segments of American society, the sort of future civic leadership, and all locations. Now we say the world, so we don't just say the United States. We see in our thinking about what we offer students who are enrolled, we see quality and access as one and the same goal for several reasons. We see diversity in perspective, perspective that varies by students' background, as essential to the excellence they give each other and to our institutional purposes. If you ask Harvard alums what they valued the most in their college education, they say, perhaps over politely, it was what they learned from each other. We do have a faculty too, and they're very distinguished, but the thing that people always mention first in these surveys for what they're worth. But the first principle, as Mary said earlier this morning, the fundamental principle, which we spent a lot of time on yesterday, is that you can't be admitted unless you apply. So we work, like all our institutions, to identify the most talented students with the help of many people and a lot of data. I'll explain in a second what we mean by talent. By now, our alumni network, who are key to everything we do, include over 14,000 individuals around the world, about 9,000 of them in the United States, who act as our local sentries, our sort of ground troops. The UK alumni, by the way, are among our very best. And I spoke last night with some of you who had been recently in conversation with some of our alumni leaders, which pleased me to hear. Our interviewers, speak with applicants, and they help us also to court those who were admitted, because people who were admitted to Harvard in places like us in the United States, and I suspect this is true here, often have other very fine choices that they could make instead. We want to make sure that when we've admitted a person, we get a good crack at having them enroll. Those alumni groups are called S&S committees, schools and scholarship committees, and I tell you this because those two words, each of them is important, schools and scholarships, that flags two important elements of our mutual work with the alums. Note that these folks, the alumni, are not for the most part scholars, and they're the interviewers for us, and they reflect the civic, if you will, mix of Harvard alumni. We have, like everybody, lots of newer recruitment tools been added to the local S&S work. We use search lists provided by the testing services, which, by the way, in our case, do give students the chance to give permission to have their names and contact information shared with us who buy the lists. Maybe 100,000 students meet our broad academic parameters in the United States, American students, maybe 100,000. And we send, like everyone, competitive mail and electronic communications encouraging students to consider Harvard, and of course, acknowledging that it's difficult to be admitted. It's a delicate balance. We just announced, I think 2 weeks ago, a new program called the Harvard College Connection, HCC, which is intended to help us and a lot of other institutions who want to join with us reach out, as they say, through using the social media, the mobile social media, to students to get them to think about college, four-year colleges, selective colleges at all. In the outreach we do, it isn't just, we're not looking for 100,000 applications. By the way, if we had them, we would deal with it, but we are not hoping for that. Last year we had 35,000, more or less. We're making a national statement because we're very conscious of how we're considered to place ourselves in the United States. The statement is simple, that Harvard is open to talent, not wealth or privilege. You know this problem. I like to think that in America, most normal people think that Harvard is in Europe. That is to say, it's some distance from them. And you understand that because I think you have universities here that get, in British terms, considered the same way. So, but doing all of those communications does in fact create a lot of business and a lot of volume for us, and we have geared ourselves to try to deal with it. We can talk about that later if anybody cares to. So students, faculty, and athletic coaches and all kinds of people, and my staff especially, work to extend this future pool of applicants, the market, if you will, with all these forms of outreach. And we do a lot of travel. We travel solo and with other colleges. Again, here are some scope numbers. We do a joint travel program, typically with 5 of us at the same time, 5 institutions at the same time. In a year, we visit 180 cities. Half in the fall, in the United States, half in the fall and half in the spring, which begins our work on the next year's pool. We greet that way about 40,000 students, we greet that way about 55,000 students and 2,000 guidance counselors whom we have for breakfast, if you can believe this, in various locations around the country. But we also greet right at home in Cambridge, about 40,000 visitors that we know who come to the admissions tours each year. They come we are open 6 days a week typically, every day but Sunday, for group sessions and tours. In the selection process, a lot of talents are valued, not only academic ones. This makes us somewhat different from some other places. From an applicant pool last year of 35,000, we select typically about 2,000. We're trying to yield a final class of about 1,660. But to be a realistic candidate, one has to have what by American national standards are excellent academic credentials, and beyond that, some distinguishing excellence, as we call it, DE in the terminology, to set one apart. Last year, we were able to offer admission to about 6%, just under 6% of our applicants. And most of the applicants, this we share with the other selective colleges here, and who could have been invited, about 80% of our applicants, over 80% of our applicants, could do our work with some measure of grace, some competence. So this is where the judgment part begins. The selection process, ours, is not designed for efficiency or speed. It's time intensive, and it includes multiple iterative discussions, consideration by several readers, typically, and a series of committees, endless discussion. We run a multifactorial process, and academic success is just the beginning. The same committee considers many different factors all at once. We don't have an academic group that clears people, and then their musical group that clears people, and so on. It's all the same door and the same people. A candidate with truly unusual academic accomplishment, this is just to reassure you, as attested, for example, by published research, a mathematical proof, a novel, a good one, will be admitted, barring problems of character, which, by the way, are not unknown, and sometimes they're not known ahead of time, but that's a different story. Our faculty, in each of those cases, our faculty alone make those determinations of excellence, not me. I might have an opinion, but I'm not making that academic judgment. The standard for admission, mainly on academic criteria, taking those people, is so high that only about 300 applicants a year meet it, class of 1660 more or less. As Elliot said, we want the best of the academics. Many students are admitted on the basis of other distinctions. Do the arithmetic. Those might be exceptional artistic or athletic accomplishments, or something harder to characterize, such as a record of overcoming obstacles. Highly subjective. We know from experience that non-academic accomplishments, and we've measured this, by the way, to the extent that one can measure it, non-academic accomplishments may be considered as surrogates for the energy and focus that translate into success in post-college life. Remember, we're looking at very highly qualified applicants from whom we're selecting a few. So ambition and energy, and we're very big on ambition, enthusiasm, resilience are, for us, major considerations, and the question is always, 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 what has she done with what she's had? This is, by the way, not a question of what someone tells you in an essay. You can read the essay. You should read the essay. We do read the essays. This is a question of accomplishment. Does the student work to help support her family, care for a disabled sibling? Is the academic preparation, this is important for us, is the academic preparation thin because the school offers a modest program? By the way, we know, and you know, I think, that the correlation between test scores, especially in the United States, and income is very strong, and it's a stronger correlation than it is with any other external factor. High income, parental education associated with each other get you, more often than not, higher test scores. So we're wary of those tests. We like them, but we're wary of using them too heavily. The bar for even non-quantifiable excellences, these things that seem ephemeral a little bit, is a high bar, and the evaluation requires care and experience. We have a quite experienced and very large committee. We're not admitting schools or programs, but people. The senior faculty member of the admissions committee loves to say that we admit the best students from the best schools in the world, and we admit the best from the worst schools. And by the way, over a third now of our students who come to Harvard are admitted from independent schools, many of which have recruited the kind of student from very modest background that we're spending a lot of this conference and talking about. Those schools are increasingly, as are the parochial schools, a major source for us of students who fall into the lower socioeconomic categories. Class, of course, is a word we're not allowed to use in America, but neither tests nor success in preparation, excellent preparation, have proved to provide the kind of discrimination we need. This is not enough, preparation, tests, and so on. Character and personal qualities, I hesitate to say this, but I should just mention it. They matter to us, though we don't have a crystal ball or perfect knowledge. The application process is designed to elicit that kind of information, offering a lot of opportunities, several anyway, to help us answer the question, which is the question, who are you anyway? We require letters from teachers as well as a letter from the school, supplementing the record of marks and program, as well as official test results. You in the UK, I think, have much better test preparation despite its imperfections, but that's another topic, as we all know. We and our alumni interview students, and we may require, and often do, a second interview if the first one seems off the mark. We read anything an applicant sends, a letter from her employer, her parish priest, and so on. We read lots of stuff. We assess supplementary information such as submissions of poetry, music, artistic slides. The faculty do that for us. We, the committee, may spend an hour or so on a complex case initially, and then more time later, and then maybe later. The accomplishment, by the way, is really we try to look at the things that are accomplishment, not on the self-packaging, which is a whole other topic in America. It should be worth, I ought to mention that our graduation rate is 98%, which I think is the highest among American universities. So this somewhat subjective process at the top of the applicant pool is not, it serves that narrow function well. Anyway, the process of making decisions really reminds you of one of Bismarck's cautions about watching sausages get made. It's messy, it's unscientific, it's got a lot of data, and it includes a lot of voices, extensive and invariably helpful information, though it varies in its quality. And in the end, a decision by, and this is a different aspect of our process from anybody else's in America, I think, we make our decisions by majority vote of maybe 40 people sitting in a room who typically have heard each case more than once, may include faculty members, includes my very good professional staff. And then as soon as decisions are made, we turn our attention to recruiting them to accept our offer. The competition in America is significant, as we're very proud to say. We do not rank candidates. We were talking last night at dinner about what you do when you get a phone call about someone not getting in. Well, that's the story of my life. I think some others here too. We don't rank candidates. It ought to be clear by now, there are days when I really long for an academically or any other way rank-ordered list of candidates. I could point to it when people call me and say, why wasn't my daughter admitted? I could say she was here, we were there. But we wouldn't know how to do that. There'd be no agreement at Harvard about what that should be, and it wouldn't produce the results we want. We're very results-oriented, very pragmatic. Remember, we came out of the hard Scrabble past, our Scrabble past. Chairman of the math department said to me the other day, we can only win the Putnam mathematics competition once a year. This is to satisfy the math department and our own sense of ego, but that we're not interested in producing the second-ranked team, too. Take that for what it's worth. Anyway, I should note a couple of elements lurking in the background that are pretty important. One is the crucial role of faculty, well beyond the narrow question of making fine levels of academic discrimination, which I already said they do. We want the most academically promising students in the world, but we know that most of our graduates will not pursue academic careers. Faculty know the difference between teaching interesting people who might contribute, should contribute more broadly to their communities, and teaching mere grind, people who ground themselves to get the tests and the grades. A former member of my faculty committee loves to say also that we shouldn't waste spaces on Ds, which paraphrases an old nursery rhyme, a diller, a dollar, a second-rate scholar. In other words, we're not necessarily interested in the people just below the top on their academic qualifications. We want to then look for things that are truly excellent. American pragmatism, this sounds like, or a preference for enrolling people who will have a great influence later in the years of their lives that will greatly outnumber, we hope, the 4 years they would be at Harvard. So our faculty, too, and this has been a constant work in progress, get it, that we're in the business of futures. Another key ingredient, money, is critical in our system in a way that's different here. We have these very high sticker prices, and for decades, we and some other lucky colleges have been able to guarantee that we'll meet the demonstrated need of every admitted student. But need is very different from willingness to pay. In recent decades, we've focused on making Harvard affordable to families in the lowest income ranges. Families in higher income ranges notice that sticker price more. In the past decade, we've increased our annual scholarship budget to $162 million this year. That's Harvard's money. For most families, and this is really a contextual thing, for most American families, Harvard costs no more or less for 93% of American families, no more or less than the local state university, the flagship state university. This is a surprising message to a lot of people, and we use, when we say it, what we learned about attracting students from ethnic minority groups and from certain geographic areas where we've had to really fight hard to get students to think about so-called elite institutions. Elite increasingly comes now to mean, I think, top talent, broadly defined, because of all the work we've all done. Though over 25% of our students are now drawn from the bottom half, 25% from the bottom half of the U.S. income distribution. We have a ways to go, obviously, before we can claim to represent an equally accessible opportunity. Our country's opportunity structure, and this is the thing we're all struggling against, I think, handicaps some of the very most promising students and people. And our process is designed largely to get past that surface into the substance. So let me just acknowledge once more the broad background to our thinking. Harvard's in America. We can't ever forget this. It's very tempting for us to forget this. However important it is for us to be in the world, 11% of this year's freshman class came from abroad and hold foreign passports. We know that we and other elite institutions, American and otherwise, are regarded with great suspicion by many. We know that Harvard can't maintain its excellence unless it's understood to be part of the broader society we serve. Education is still seen as the ticket to the American dream, however inadequate. We know that if we fail to keep our gates open to talent, not to birth advantages, we'll fail to do the thing we were set up to do and still hope to do. So until the enormous increase 5 years ago under Larry Summers, a little more than 5 years ago, in our financial aid, we were falling very short, as you can see, of those goals. And we're very conscious of how much remains to be done, which is only one reason why I'm so glad to be here. But we are simply in the business of futures. And long-range futures is the perspective we try to keep. And I will now sit down and tell you how pleased I would be to answer questions or participate in the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike. Okay, so Mike Nicholson is Director of Undergraduate Admissions and Outreach at Oxford University, responsible for coordinating admissions, access and student recruitment across the university. And Mike's developed a sort of great reputation as a lucid pundit on access and admissions issues, recently hitting the headlines telling a conference that Michael Gove's exam reforms were, I quote, another great example of the government's tendency to meddle in things they should probably really leave alone, and that they threaten to wreck the English education system. I'm assuming Michael Gove wasn't in the room at the time, although you probably... but anyway, I hope Mike will be as forthright today with his comments. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Lee. Slight correction, I said it was governments, not this government.
Oh, right.
All governments tend to meddle, in my experience. Just a few things to start off with. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come and speak today. I think this has been a conference where we've had a really good opportunity to discuss both informal sessions and over coffee the interesting variations in the education systems around the world. I think what I'm most struck by is nobody seems to have got it right yet. And we can all learn lessons from each other, but I think we also need to recognise there are some substantial differences that exist between the education systems, and not all lessons learned can be directly applied to the UK system or the US system or the continental European system. So we've been privileged to find out about. What I want to do in the time that I've got is, first of all, talk about the admissions process at Oxford. I apologise for those of you who've heard this a million times before, but I think one of the fascinating aspects of just the brief time I've been at Oxford, 7 years, is the amount of change in a fairly brief period of time in the approach that we take. And one of my concerns is that many people's perceptions of the Oxford admissions process, and for many other selective universities as well, is often formed by the experiences of the people who are commentating 20, 30, 40 years ago without necessarily regard to what's happening now. We also, of course, have this issue, I think, with social mobility. The people who the Sutton Trust are writing about occupying the top places in society were people who were admitted 20, 30, 40 years ago, and it would be maybe interesting to see how many of them would be admitted now under the current admissions processes that selective universities use. I'll let that one hang there for a moment whilst people contemplate. I think a few things to start off with. It's been fascinating hearing about Harvard's approach and purpose. I think it is really important to emphasise that certainly Oxford and I think many other UK universities are primarily selecting students on their academic suitability for a particular course. There is a massive difference between a liberal arts selection, because students will not necessarily be declaring their majors for 2 years into the course, and identifying who's a biochemist at point of entry. So I think we need to be clear that we are probably, in the two education systems, going for two very, very different initial purposes. Certainly at Oxford, there is kind of clarity of purpose. We are selecting the students who, at the point of application, show the greatest potential to be successful at Oxford in the tutorial education system that we offer. It's a very, very narrow and a very focused purpose, but it is one that we can actually then form an admissions process around and target candidates appropriately. I think it's also worth pointing out that Oxford has had a lot of debate in the last 10 years, and key areas, I think, where there's been significant shift. There is clarity on a common purpose in the sense that we agree that college choice is not a factor in selection. We are selecting students on their suitability for engineering or English literature, and the selection criteria are very clearly published and agreed within the subject area. So the experience of applying to do engineering at Somerville College should not vary at all from the experience of applying to do engineering at St John's, but what we're looking for in an engineer is different from what we're looking for an English literature student. And again, I think it's very important that people recognise that this is a really clear shift maybe in purpose in the way that Oxford now does things compared to how things were maybe done 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think the other thing to point out is we've also seen quite a shift in our staffing. 30, 40, 50 years ago, many of the people who would be doing the selecting were themselves products of the system. And probably the biggest shift at Oxford has been the change in the tutorial staff at the university. So almost 50% of our tutors are not themselves UK educated, and most of those who come to work at the university have not studied at the university or at Cambridge. And I think that's actually a helpful thing because it opens up debate. People bring their experience from elsewhere, and they question why we do things constantly, which is a healthy thing. I think if everybody accepted that everything's set in stone and perfect, then that's where the weakness would be. And the biggest change I found in my time working at Oxford compared to my previous roles in admissions is actually, as far as I'm concerned, I'd much rather have a very, very highly engaged tutorial body who want to do admissions well and all think that they're my boss. Because with 1,600 bosses, then actually I'm always under scrutiny and the process is always under scrutiny. In previous institutions where I've had experience, I might be the only person in a particular subject area outside my subject discipline who actually cares about who gets in. So I think it's important to recognise that there is a lot of engagement, but I think that is a very, very positive element of how Oxford approaches its selection. We are working with a lot of information, and I think it's important again to recognise that we look for information throughout the admissions process. We have the information that comes to us through UCAS, so we have a reference from the student school, we've got a personal statement that the candidate themselves has written, we have their prior academic record, and we have some predictions about their future success. And all universities will use this to a greater or lesser extent. The advantage that Oxford has is we can sometimes ask for more, in fact we frequently do ask for more. So most of our candidates now, 90% plus this year, have taken some form of subject-based aptitude test. And that's a big shift in the last 5 years. Why do we do aptitude tests? Well, it's partly a reflection of the fact that our candidate nature is changing. Just in the 7 years I've been at Oxford, we've seen our undergraduate applicant pool go from about 23% non-UK to 34%. And in some of our subject disciplines, economics and management, our most popular and oversubscribed course, almost 50% of our candidates are applying from outside the UK and most not with A-level. So on that basis, having aptitude tests that everybody has to take for that particular subject area is a very, very helpful benchmarking exercise. So regardless of a candidate's background, education, we do get some fairly useful reads on the candidate's potential and suitability for the course because what we're testing is aptitude. The tests, however, and again this is one of the misconceptions, are very good at identifying who is likely not to succeed at Oxford. What they are not is a ranking tool to say who is definitely going to end up with a first-class degree 3 years on from taking the test. And I think, again, we've got to recognise that there will be some students who get admitted they will have gone through the admissions process, and things will happen to them on course that mean that they may not get the degree that we thought they had the potential to get. There will be other students who might surprise us. But generally speaking, the admissions process is trying to, at a point in time, use all the available evidence to identify who, 3 or 4 years down the line, will have made a success of their tutorial education experience. We also have submitted coursework, particularly in the humanities subjects, to look at. We will do multiple interviews, and again, I think the important thing to recognise about interviewing is a helpful tool if it's done properly. If it's done well, if the people conducting the interview have been properly trained, or aware that they have potential for bias, where you have more than one interviewer in the room so that there's a kind of internal check, and you have multiple interviews. If you've got all of those conditions and the academic interview is the focus, not a, oh, I see that, you know, in your spare time you did this and that and the other, probably because of your background, then actually there's a value to having that into the admissions process, because as a colleague of mine said fairly recently, effectively what you have in the interview is an audition, an opportunity to see how the candidate will behave in a tutorial. And that's quite important. But what our tutors are trained to do in their preparation is spot the candidate who is polished, but actually has very little substance behind that polish, but also identify the candidate who is nervous and may not yet be showing their full potential. And again, one of the advantages of having multiple interviews is if a candidate has a bad interview, then at least it gives you the opportunity to sort of ignore that interview and assess how they've performed elsewhere. And then finally, we use a lot of context. As a university, we've been very conscious about the need to engage with contextual information. Contextual information comes in many forms. Some of it is actually bits of statistical information. Some of it is what we will read in the personal statement, and probably more importantly in the reference about a candidate's background. And I think one of the other myths is we don't care about this sort of thing. Actually, we do. Typically, a candidate's UCAS application will be read from between 3 and 10 tutors, depending on how far they get through the process. So this will be picked over, analysed, discussed, analysed again, and when we come down to it, the decisions that we make are consensus decisions. No one tutor determines who gets in. It has to be a consensus decision of all of those who've been involved in the process. So where does that leave us? Well, firstly, we have a lot of reallocation and redistribution around our process. So candidates can still express a preference for a college. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where they're going to end up. And we do a lot of moving around to reflect the fact that we want the best candidates for the course, not necessarily have their decisions determined by often what's quite a random decision as to which college they apply to. So 25% of students at Oxford will now get an offer from a college that they didn't originally apply to. And there's quite a lot of allocation going on even before candidates are called for interview. So a good example of this, Balliol College, typically a year now will get 200 applications for philosophy, politics and economics. They have 15 places. They'll probably want to interview about 45 of those candidates. But based on the evidence, there'll probably be at least another 100 of the Balliol applicants who will be excellent students, and we allocate them to other colleges before we call them in for interview. So they will make up, because they're strong candidates, for maybe weaker candidates elsewhere in the system. So we are trying to kind of constantly refine our systems to identify the candidates who seem to be strongest. Where we're using personal information, where we're using context, we're using a basket of measures. There are no silver bullets. We've looked to see if there's a key piece of evidence, if we had it, it would make all the difference. Actually, there isn't. So you need lots of bits of information which collaboratively together will give you a useful picture. And we look at both socioeconomic information and we look at academic achievement, both for the candidate themselves in the context of the school they were at and the school overall. And then we'll also factor in for things like, has the student been in care for more than 3 months? Because that will have a bearing on their overall performance and their experiences. So where does this leave us? Well, we are in a situation, and it's been very helpful to hear the Harvard statistics, where Harvard are looking for around about 1,600 candidates. We are looking for about 3,200 at the end of our process. Harvard will make around about 2,000 offers to get those 1,600. We will make 3,500 to get 3,200 because the attrition rate on a candidate holding an Oxford offer is limited. Very few students fail to make the grade. A small number might decide for a variety of very good reasons they might want to go somewhere else. And I think one of the key statistics that came out of the conversation is going back to the issues around funding and resource, Harvard have £100 million a year in the way of financial aid for their 1,600 students. Oxford has currently about £8 million a year for financial aid for potentially up to 3,200 students. Where are the problems? I'm glad Mary mentioned unique learner numbers. We do have problems tracking students from the outreach activity, and I think linking the people doing the outreach into the admissions process is a key area for success in widening participation. I think we are also aware that there is a lot of candidates who do not declare information in the admissions process that would help them because they are nervous at the outcome. So a very good example of that is disability. Despite the fact that we have very good protection in the disability legislation in this country, many candidates will not declare a disability at the point of application because they are worried it would put an admissions tutor off from taking them at any university. Now at Oxford, routinely, after candidates have been sent offers in January, we will write out and say, okay, fess up. How many of you actually have a disability? When we did that last year, and we copied this from Cambridge, basically we've got another 90 disability declarations. And I think one of the areas where we can work with UCAS is if all candidates were asked after they had received their 5 offers through the track system, okay, tell us about your ethnicity, tell us about whether your parents went to university, tell us about, so all the things they've been asked to declare up front, if we asked them again, we'd probably get some very useful and cleaner data because it wasn't such high stakes as far as the candidates or their parents were concerned. And then finally, there's been some real value in doing things like contextual flagging, which have had unintended benefits and consequences. So our careers service looked at the flagging that we'd done on candidates who were at the university and how they engaged with the careers service. And what we've identified is candidates from the most disadvantaged quintile, first of all, tend to go on and do very well after graduation because they've got real incentive to get a job. They aren't going to be able to go back home and, live the high life. They need to do something immediately they leave university. They're often very focused. They know why they're coming to university because it will give them a better opportunity. But they also are the group who are most likely to engage at the earliest opportunity with the careers service because they don't have their own networks to rely upon. I mean, this is not rocket science, but what it effectively means is now, as soon as candidates arrive, our careers service can get in touch with the students who come from the quintiles, the most disadvantaged quintiles, and say, hey, we're the careers service, and we're here to help, and here's some of the stuff we can do to assist you. It's also meant that we've put a lot of emphasis now on providing internships, paid internships, to our most disadvantaged undergraduates, often using alumni to provide those opportunities so that they can begin to develop the links and the networks that are going to get them the jobs that they want at the end of the course. So, I'm sorry I've probably taken a little bit more time than anticipated, but I hope that's given you a fairly clear indication of the amount of care and attention we try to take in selecting the students who are most academically able for success. As I said not so long ago to the headmasters' conference, who tend to get very worried about any attempt that the university is using contextual information, I really don't care whether candidates are poor and bright or rich and bright. I want the bright ones. If they're thick and rich, they're the ones I'm hoping our process can exclude. Now that sounds like a pretty sweeping statement, but the thing that really kind of links our students together is they are all there on academic merit, they've demonstrated that they can cope with the tutorial environment, and they're all really smart. And that's, I think, the thing that we should be trying to encourage in a higher education system that is supposed to be identifying students with real potential for success, irrespective of social background, irrespective of wealth. Thank you very much.
Thanks, okay, last but not least, Olle ten Cate, I hope that's the right pronunciation, or maybe not. Professor of Medical Education at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, heads up the Centre for Research and Development into Medical Education, and you've been involved in many of the discussions about admissions to Dutch medical schools over a 20-year period, and today you're going to tell us a bit about the national lottery approach that was adopted but has since been reviewed. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I do have some slides, so just feel free to join the audience if you want to see the slides on this side. I was asked to spend about 10 minutes introducing you with the Dutch system of admission to medical schools. So I'm just talking about medical schools, just talking about the Netherlands. And I will give some details on that admission system that includes a national weighted lottery system for many, many years, actually. It is in discussion at this moment. I'll explain that to you. Just to give you some background about the Netherlands. We have a population of almost 17 million inhabitants. We have 8 medical schools. All our medical schools are public schools. We don't have private schools. Our first year enrollment, determined by the government, is about 3,000 medical students to first year of medical school. We have a 6-year course in for medicine. The ratio of that number is, and the fact that the government determines it, is in fact the labor market and the cost of education. And it is yearly evaluated by the government and determined per year again. But it has been about 3,000 for a number of years now. The ratio of males over females since, I would say, around mid-90s, the 1990s, is 2 to 3, which actually means that between 60 and 70% of our enrolling medical students are females, not males, which is in contrast to some other data that we have seen this morning. And we have been used to that. So it's about 20 years that we face that ratio out. The number of applicants varies every year. Now this year, 2013, it is about 9,000. So that's about 3 times as many as we have places available. Our current admission for medical school is actually a mix of 3 processes. One is free access for the most bright students, a weighted lottery system, and local selection procedures. The prerequisite to go to medical school is secondary education with a package called Nature and Health as a preparation. If you don't have that, you're not eligible to get into medical school. So the system of our education roughly looks like this. Everybody goes to primary education. Now there is several sorts of secondary education. Most to the left you see what's called here pre-university education. If you would want to go to university, you need to go to the pre-university secondary school education. Around year 18, you get into, you can eligible to go into university education. And if you would want to go to medical schools of the university, as I said, you need that package of Nature and Health within the pre-university education, that package. If you don't have that, you can go to medical school. So now the circle actually delineates the moment of our selection procedure. And what does it, the weighted lottery element of that procedure looks like. Just a few words on history. It is operational since 1975. In fact, 1972, a regular lottery system was operated, not a weighted lottery system. And I happened to be a person in the first cohort in 1972, and I drew a lot that did not allow me to go to medical school. So I was happily taking a year off, went to the United States to a college education, and then came back to the Netherlands, and here I got into medical school. But since 1975, it's a weighted lottery system. It has been the sole admission procedure until around 1997, excuse me. Now the weighting within this lottery system is based on the average score for the national secondary school examination. Every student going to university has to take that national secondary school examination. Now our examinations in the Netherlands result in scores from 1 to 10. That is our basic school scoring system all across all education. So what you can, the weighted lottery system actually results in a weighting in that lottery admission system. So if you are a top scorer, which means you have an average score of 8 to 10, there's free access to medical school. If you have a scoring between 7.5 and 8, you have 9 times as, actually 3 times as many chance to get in compared to those who have a score between 6 and 6.5. So there's strata, you could say, there's 4 strata that actually allows you to have more chances if you have higher average scores. And we operate that in the Netherlands by over the summer, when high school examination results have been published and people have applied, that the lottery system is applied a few times across the summer, between July and the end of September, actually. So if you have higher scores, your lot is thrown back into the pool again, pond again, and then you have another chance to be picked out. So that is basically our lottery system. Now have been changes in the model. As I told you already, so the first years actually there was an unweighted lottery system. Now the weighted lottery system has been actually in this model operational until the end of the 90s. In 2000 to 2005, selection was added as an option for medical schools. So we had the weighted lottery system, and including the 8+. Now maybe I should show you, if we go back to this slide again, the free access was actually introduced in 1999. So the weighted lottery system was across the whole range before that time. Now, so in about 2000, that was the first year that we had a weighted lottery system, the free access for what we call the 8+ group, and also the option for schools to choose to do maximum 10% of their enrollment through local selection procedures. That number for local selection procedures has increased in the second half of the past decade to 50%, and the government has recently decided that the weighted lottery system, including also the free access for 8+, will be abandoned, and all schools should have qualitative local selection procedures from 2016 on. Personally, I'm not happy with that. I think we have had a very sensible system for about 40 years, but there's other reasons why that has been changed. In fact, applicants and society no longer accept a lottery system. That was triggered very much by one single incident, and the incident was in 1997, when a bright secondary school student with an average score of 9.6, think of it, 9.6 on the 10-point scale, was rejected 3 times. That was before the 8+ category was established. That led to I would say, a sort of societal uproar, and there was a committee installed, and it was years that you could read every day in the newspaper. The legislation was adapted, including a guarantee for those bright students to get into medical school. Now, and further, after that moment, further liberal sentiment in our politics and society has led to the decision to have a 100% selection system in a few years from now. Now, I didn't talk about underrepresented groups because that was not much been on the agenda. But if you think of it, as I said already, the Dutch male students are predominantly female, but also predominantly white. Interestingly, it is not a topic that is much in debate in the Netherlands, but it has huge implications. We can see, and I'll show you a graph of that too, that the Dutch healthcare is actually changing. Dutch healthcare was, a few decades ago, was a male-dominated system. It will be a female-dominated system very soon. And so far, there's no reports on major attempts to widen access for minorities. So the direct weighting of any things like gender, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status is actually not legally possible. And using criteria that will indirectly favor, however, and I can say that because a representative of our Ministry of Education visited a conference of medical education last week, and I heard her say that they would actually stimulate procedures that would give more advantages to males to get into medical school without calling that selection for males, because, of course, that is against our Constitution. At the same time, also, it was said that even schools that can pick their own selection procedures are not allowed to use any lottery system, because that was, in fact, one of the systems that is not possible anymore. So here what you see here is graph that shows the feminization among Dutch postgraduate medical trainees. So from those who go out of medical schools, who are already dominated by females, there is this, so these are standardized numbers, and in 2000, the standardization has put on a score of 100. You can still see that there's a hugely growing number of females, which is the purple bar, the purple graph, as compared to the blue graph of the males. So our healthcare is actually becoming very much, very quickly actually, a female group. I would like to give you 9 statements that are somewhat personal statements, but I have background information that I don't have the time to show you, but I think I can defend them. For one thing, within our system, I would be willing to defend that 80% of our Dutch applicants are apt for medical school, the way we have been selecting in the past too. One of the reasons that I can say that is, for instance, if you look at the quality of healthcare, the Netherlands score rather highly on the European Consumer Index, for instance. So patients like our healthcare system. And that is partly because the people that work in healthcare do quite well. And we know it if we look at our experiences of our lottery system, that actually most of those people, I would say 80 to 90% of those people actually do quite well. Actually, they finish well, they do their schooling well, and they become residents and specialists.
Olle, just if you, because I'm just conscious of time, so I wanted to go, so if you go through your 9 points fairly quickly, just so I can open to questions.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
It's always the disadvantage to be the third one. So the reason for selection for medical school in the Netherlands is not a need for better students or better doctors. Another statement is applicants' frustrations after rejections leads to blaming something. If there's a lottery system, the lottery system will be blamed. Now, my prediction is the schools will be blamed. We cannot predict at age 18 whether an applicant will become a superior doctor. I'll show you data about that, don't have them here, but there are data. In the Dutch context, the weighted lottery system with 8+ outperforms any qualitative selection procedure in fairness for applicants. I'm willing to defend that. Another statement is, benefits of selection lie not in the criteria applied, but in the effort to enter medical school. So my statement would be, there is some benefit in selection procedures, not on any criteria that we use, but just because the people put effort in going through a selection procedure and actually change. I've called that a Hawthorne effect. Psychologists among you might recognize that. It's not the measurement, is not measuring something, but it's actually changing the behavior of the student just because of the measuring. The secondary school system is the most significant selection procedure, strongly favoring males over females with huge effects on the nature of healthcare in the future. The motivation of applicants is probably related to a general consumer sentiment in the population. I'll show you a graph about that. And the Netherlands now, and I'm quoting a colleague, is moving from a transparent lottery system to an transparent casino system.
Right, thank you very much.
No,
sorry, you got the...
I have a few slides, just a few minutes. So this is the the comparison of the number of places that we have and the number of applicants. And you can see the number of applicants is actually steeply growing at this moment, over 9,000 at this moment. If you would compare that with some index of consumer confidence in the future, this is what consumer confidence looks like. So what we think is that when our economic, and the Netherlands are lagging behind in Europe in dealing with our crisis, but you can see that students with a little time lag are probably choosing for medicine when economics are not as good. So in conclusion, that's my last slide. The Netherlands experienced 40 years of weighted lottery for admission of medical students for studies with a government-determined limitation. The gradual replacement by 100% local selection is based, I would say, on weak psychometric justification, not on anything of reliability or predictive validity, despite other people who would say that. I'm happy to defend this too. And the effect of this transition on admissions of underrepresented groups is not yet known, and it's not much on the agenda. It might have effect, and probably effect not in the direction that you would like to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll have three questions. I'm going to come back to the male-female issue, which was asked in the previous session. But any questions? On the left over here, and then I'll come to you, Stu, next.
Steve Jones, University of Manchester. Thank you very much. It's always fascinating to hear how admissions processes work overseas. In the British system, we tend to spend a lot of time looking at academic suitability and predicting outcomes. Do you think we should be more confident, or perhaps we're actually underconfident, about our ability to produce high-class graduates who come out of our system, regardless of their background when they enter the system?
What I have tried to defend.
So, Olle, sorry, I want to take three questions, and Stu, do you want to?
Hi, I'm Stu Schmill from MIT, and also thank you. So really interesting and quite a spectrum, and I want to ask about retention in disciplines. Because there's quite a spectrum from in the U.S. where students don't have to choose a discipline until midway through their university career, to choosing specific disciplines here in the U.K., and then choosing actual medical school at the end of secondary school, actually before the end of medical school, because while still in secondary school they have to actually have a particular module in order to go to medical school. And I guess it's my sense that particularly lower income students maybe have less exposure and less knowledge of different disciplines, and I wonder if you've either done research or are aware of differences that occur in having students having had to choose so early on what they want to do for a career.
Okay, so we'll take those three questions. Olle, did you want to start on that first question? Do you want to have a go at that first, and then ask our other panel members to?
So the question was whether Manchester or UK schools should be advised to use lottery, right? I must add to what I said, and that's what I started out with. That I'm talking about the Netherlands, the Dutch system, and we have our high school system with our national high school examination, actually provides us with applicants who are quite equal, and we have very much difficulty, I would say, to make a distinction between the more suitable and not suitable, or more apt or not apt. So definitely for the Dutch system, I'd be happy to very much defend it. Now in other countries where there's a greater variety of applicants coming to medical schools, it might be wise to do a more qualitative selection. So before my ability to answer your question, I should actually have some more information about the disparity of groups that actually come to Manchester or other UK schools to advise it.
Okay. Any other members of the panel want to come back on that question and comment on it?
I think from the research we've done at Oxford, attainment is still probably the best indicator of outcome. We are, I think, very conscious that you need to have a good evidence base for any activity you do, and therefore having multiple points and multiple bits of information allows us to kind of build up a fairly comprehensive picture of maybe what works and what doesn't work. I would say the other issue linked into that is the hefty research, many years old now, but I gather being repeated, looking at whether school type makes a difference. I think, generally beyond a certain point, it makes no difference. The hefty research, which everybody kind of conveniently forgets, suggested candidates with 3 A's or better by school type, no variation in outcome. Below that, yes, there is, and I think it's interesting that a number of universities are taking that information on board and factoring that into their admissions process. But if you're selecting at the top end, then school type isn't the issue. I think what we need to be conscious of with attainment is, I don't want to blame the teaching profession, I don't want to blame anybody. I think the recognition, though, is we can't just expect the higher education sector on its own to resolve that issue by the way that we do our admissions process. We talked a lot yesterday about where should we put in our effort. I tend to agree that early years is a much more significant area for social activity and intervention than trying to fiddle around with an admissions process at the back end.
Okay. Marlyn, did you?
I was trying to emphasize, as I know you've heard, the fact that we don't rank our candidates in any ordinal way. Neither do we have much good information. This is a little bit Stuart's thing, but that was more about migration, I think. We have very, I think imperfect information about how people rank when they leave. We can make a very clear distinction and indeed can predict very precisely with very good predictability the people who graduate what we call summa cum laude. That's the 100 or so students who graduate with the very top level of honors. Interestingly, you won't be surprised, I think, that that's associated with combination of the best preparation and the highest income at home. There are, as we say, I say, there are no walk-ons. That's like they weren't recruited for this. No people who sort of join unpredictably and surprisingly that summa ranks, virtually none, a couple a year. And there are a goodly number of people who would have been summas had they not made some other choice, something else intervened, or they decided to do something else, or their mother died, or something like this. But that's a very stable group, quite predictable. Partly aided by American grade inflation, where grades are not terribly high anymore across the board. We can make very few distinctions. We've begun to look carefully, now that we have more students in the lower income groups, at how they do, and the answer's not very satisfactory. They do about the same as everybody else. That's good news. I think we don't understand it terribly well, but most people graduate and they mostly have very high grades.
Okay. Mary, did you want to talk about the discipline choice? Did you want to say anything about the question on disciplines?
I suppose just to say that I think a good outcome of the increase in fees is that it has meant that I think there's evidence that our applicants are making more considered choices about what they do. And I think in the past there was probably a kind of top-level group who kind of, probably exaggerating to make the point, but almost kind of sleepwalked into higher education because that's what they always expected. So I think there are some good outcomes that people are saying, well, I need to be really sure that this is right for me. It's also got 3 times more expensive to drop out than it was in the past. It's worth remembering that.
On discipline choice, anything else that other panel members want to respond on?
I think there's some interesting sort of issues around that. Retention at Oxford is 98%. So very few students ever drop out, and we fight very hard to keep hold of them once we've got them through the door. I think it's interesting that Offa are beginning to look at the issue around retention. I've always said that it's not just about access. There's no point admitting people if effectively you have a revolving door and those students a year down the line are out of the university, and then they're even worse off by that experience, I would suggest, than never having gone. I think the discipline difference is an interesting one. One of the issues for most selective universities is what we offer isn't 100% of what people want to do. And some of the statistics Mary showed about BTEC would suggest that actually there are courses that we offer at Oxford that likelihood is no BTEC student would ever want to go and do, with one notable exception, which is art and design, where actually we very much welcome BTEC because those students have to produce a portfolio, and a BTEC student is much more likely to have a very good portfolio of artwork than students who've been doing A-level. I think the other thing is, though, it's often down to competitiveness for courses, and I think this is a major variation between the US and the UK system. So if we look at 2 disciplines that are both trying to recruit 150 students a year at Oxford, we have our classics courses where 75% of the applicants are from the independent sector, 25% are state educated. We have 3 applicants per place. For medicine, we have 75% of the applicants from the state sector, 25% from the independent sector, and there are 10 applicants per place. So what we often find is that good, well-qualified state candidates are stacking up against each other for admission to our most competitive courses. I've said again in the past, you know, if we cared about state and independent mix, the obvious thing to do would be to shut down certain departments at Oxford and transfer the numbers into courses that state students want to do. But that's not what we're about. We're a university. There are very few world-class classics departments. There are an awful lot of medical schools. And actually, it's important that we protect the research that we've been doing and the activity we've been doing by providing an opportunity. What we need to do at the other end is try and improve the numbers of state-educated students who might see classics as something worth doing. And we do a lot of outreach work. We have a 4-year degree now for students who come in without any background in Latin and Greek, as do our colleagues at Cambridge. We do a lot to try and demonstrate the outcomes of doing a classics degree, the type of jobs, the variety of jobs, the variety of rewards. So I think there is more we can be doing, but the simple fix is not to sort of say, well, just because we get a lot of students from this particular demographic, we should just ignore that subject in future, because that doesn't solve the problem of academia.
Okay, I just want to come on to this, the other issue of the future is female. There's some fascinating trends that Olle was talking about. Just to answer Penny's question, do you know any of the worldwide data on that? I think I've seen some data that suggests that it is a phenomenon in most developed countries, but I just wondered for Harvard and Oxford, what is the ratio at the moment in terms of male, female applicants and admittance?
For us,
entrance?
our freshman class this year is 53% more or less women and 47% more or less male. And the applicant pool is just about the same. We don't fix that ratio either to the applicant pool or to some other idea. It has changed.
And at Oxford, I think last time we looked, about 50-50 on the application. It's about 48% female, 52% male, but that probably has a lot to do with discipline.
Right.
I'm actually sorry, I just made a mistake, a terrible mistake. This year, it's 53% male and 47% female. And the past 4 years have been that's an increasing, well, it's been around 51% male to 53%, it's not a line. We had 5 years in a row of slightly more, 2 points though, more women. And when we moved under Larry Summers' guidance to this great new financial aid program, one of the things we did, we weren't targeting men more, by the way, but we did a broader outreach, and it seemed to hit more men who weren't already in the pool. You may know that in America, some ethnic groups are much more likely to send their women on to college, African Americans in particular. There's a lot of variation. Asian Americans, just the opposite. So it's right now more men than women, and we're trying to watch that. Not with a theory, though.
Mary, did you want to say?
It's probably just worth saying that certainly in the UK data, through Key Stage 1, 2, 3, Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5 and higher education, those differences between males and females are almost completely ironed out right at the very, very top level. So I'm not very surprised to hear that
Yes, that's right.
it's
That's
not so much of an issue for...
For Sutton Trust Summer Schools, it's been interesting. We have about 2/3 applications for females.
Yeah.
And we even had a campaign a few years back, Peter, to say to all the boys, that you'll be surrounded by girls, and that didn't work either, did it? But anyway. Right, sorry, another round of questions. One over here, and I'll take one at the back, and then you over here.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie from King's College London. The presentations were brilliant, and we heard about the strengths of your admission systems. I wondered if the panel could reflect on what they consider to be the greatest weakness of their admission system and how they've worked to address it or are actually still working to address it.
Okay, there's one at the back.
Leslie Kendall, research consultant working with Sutton Trust. Where universities are using additional tests as part of their admission process, what role or responsibility do you think they have to make sure that that provides a level playing field, if you like?
Okay, and there's just one over here.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Sobchak from the Brilliant Club.
I was wondering what, in particular, would you like to see schools doing in playing their part? If there was one thing you could ask schools to do, what would it be? For example, would it be more subject choice offered? Would it be smaller group sizes? Would it be just getting more A's and A stars?
Okay, so we've got the three very good questions. The weaknesses in the admissions, the role of admissions tests, and then the role of schools. Olle, do you want to start on those?
I've given some criticism of the changes in our system. What I actually think, and I'm also addressing one of the questions that was put before, I think our secondary school system is very much affecting who is actually coming into medical school. And what we have seen, have been changes in our secondary school, I would say, educational didactic model across the Netherlands in the 80s. And we see that as a result of that, we have the impression that at the age of 16, 17, the males have more difficulty to prepare for being admitted to medical school. So if our system of selection for medical schools should change, we must look also at the secondary school in the way they affect. There's neuropsychologists that actually say that the males at that age have difficulty planning. Now, if you have education that draws very much on planning ability because of the more problem-based, constructivist approaches in the schools, and people have to plan much, the females do much better than the males at that age. And it may be related to brain development, which is still underway at that age. So we're actually sorry that we miss the bright males that we can recognize when they're 22 or so, not when they're 16. So that is some of, I would say, in the Netherlands, some of the weaknesses of our system. And so even though people are, specifically the males, are not so much looking ahead very far and thinking of their careers at that age.
Okay.
Shall I leave it with this answer for now?
Thank you. So others, in terms of addressing any of those questions on the weaknesses in the admissions system, be interested in Oxford and Harvard's view on that, and also the role of admissions tests.
For me, the weaknesses of our system are the things that I said were its strengths, and to some extent, I think that. We have a subjective system, and because we're so interested in taking into account the personal story and the accomplishments associated with her rising from that personal story, we're very inclined sometimes to go for, let's call it the romantic. We're trying to find someone who would be gloriously successful if it were glorious. By the way, they are successful, so it's a little hard to quibble on the outcome. I think we, because of that, are less inclined, less good at identifying. This is a little bit what Olle was saying. We don't have a crystal ball, and we're much less patient than we probably should be in trying to understand how deep a thinker someone is, how much potential there really is. I said we were in the business of futures. I'm not sure that we always hover long enough over those intellectual future questions. Part of it's that I think we may not do, we're very fatalistic about the outcome. This is a hail fellow, well-met sort who will be, you know, with school president and various activity levels, and we think this will be very successful at Harvard, and that may be true. But someone who is less external, less overt in activity level may not be appreciated as much, and we never get to measure them because they don't come to Harvard in sufficient numbers. So I think we're a little bit over-inclined to represent this external success, whether it's tests or activities or self-promotion.
Mike, what are your weaknesses at Oxford?
No, actually. I think, first of all, we do need good information and accurate information about candidates. There's more we could be doing with contextual information, more training, more engagement of staff in some of the issues around that we've been discussing at this conference. All would be helpful, all things we can do. I think there's also, and this may sound like a flippant answer, it would be really nice if people recognised there was more than 2 universities in the UK when they looked at the admissions process. There's a lot of very, very good work going on elsewhere, and more focus on what works elsewhere in the UK I think would be helpful to improve the narrative overall. I think the issue about tests is an important one. I came to Oxford as a great sceptic about the value of admissions tests, aptitude tests. I've become a convert, partly because I've got a better understanding of the variety of very, very good candidates who all on paper on their UCAS application all look exactly the same at the point of application. I think the important things are we've got to use tests with an evidence base, that they have an impact. They can't be used on their own for a selection tool. They're part of a basket of information. And I think probably most importantly, as far as preparing candidates goes, having available information online, showing them what the tests look like, the style of questions is important. One of the reasons I quite like tests is I am absolutely of the belief that there can be preparation people can do for any type of test. No system is foolproof. But the chances of you being prepared to make a difference on the sort of tests we do at Oxford is a lot less open to school influence than GCSE and A-level preparation and training and tutoring. So I think it does help level the playing field. I think the problems often come because students assume it's going to be a bit like an A-level. And actually, if they looked in advance at a test paper, saw the style of questions, realised that actually the average candidate gets about 50%, as opposed to what they've probably been used to through their own school system of 90% plus, and not being freaked out by the fact that there might be questions that they struggle to answer. That would be good. As far as what difference can we make with the schools, actually it's about teacher training. That's where I think there's a real gap. We expect teachers, particularly now in England with the paucity of information, advice and guidance available, to do the job that careers guidance advisors were doing. There are hardly any teacher training programs I'm aware of where teachers are actually given training to give that information, advice and guidance. It's assumed that somehow, magically, they can do it. And that would be a really effective intervention. It probably wouldn't take more than a day. Most of the universities offering teacher training could probably resource it from within their own teams. That would be a significant difference.
Just on that one issue, I just wondered what Olle and Marlyn and Mary might think about schools. Is it teacher training, or just quickly, are there other things that schools could do?
Well, I think teacher training is a problem in the United States, but there are so many other problems about the public school system. Curriculum, training, time of day, how many hours they spend being instructed. I mean, we have no uniformity and, in fact, no agreement about what we should be looking for. So I think it's difficult to respond.
Okay. Olle, did you want to?
Yes, I would say there's many regulations about our secondary school education that the teachers have no influence on. So even if they would be trained, the model of their education is determined. And I know there is many teachers actually rather unhappy with the way they have to teach, just because of the way the scheduling is, and actually dictated by national education committees who actually say our education should look like this. So there is actually a debate on this whole topic, how much freedom teachers have to design their own teaching.
Right. Mary, did you want to say anything on schools? You have done in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there's a whole lot of schools for whom progression to higher education is not even on their radar screen. They're the ones who are desperately trying to get enough kids over the 5 GCSE with English and Maths hurdle, and they're probably not even that concerned with the sixth form curriculum. And I think there's a consultation open at the moment about accountability measures, which I think it's really important for us all to engage with, because certainly some of the patterns I can see in the qualifications stuff, I think you can link to behaviours that are about schools trying to meet accountability targets. In particular, I think it's important not just to look at the targets themselves, but when they are set. You know, I'm not quite sure why we have to measure everybody at 16. Isn't it better for lower achieving kids to get them to a higher level at, say, 17, rather than have them fail to get over a hurdle at 16 and then probably not engage and continue after it. So I think there's two sides to accountability, both what the measures are and also potentially looking at, for some children, measuring them a bit later, giving them some time to catch up.
Okay, thanks. I think we're running out of time now. So we're due to reconvene at 12 o'clock to hear the Minister for University Science give the keynote address. Just want to thank the panel very much for their contribution. Thank you very much.